Okay, so I want to have some real talk about education systems and academia in particular, speaking from some of my personal and professional experiences. But I also want to talk about education more generally. And, when we're thinking about institutional oppression, usually education is viewed as an antidote to that, right? Usually education is what people talk about when they're like, here's a pathway out of oppression. Here's a pathway for marginalized populations to get them on the same playing field as populations with a lot of privilege. Very often we talk about education as this sort of mechanism. I'm sure you all know there are issues with education systems as well. And some of what I would perceive as fundamental flaws of our education system are really things that we're needing to address if we want education to be this pathway towards social justice. It's hard in a time when it already feels like the social environment around us is overwhelming and totally unjust to begin with. It's hard to kind of delve into a topic like education that, I don't know, may feel less significant, or again, some may perceive this as a positive pathway, a pathway out of institutional oppression. And yet, one of the themes that we've been talking about is we have to come to terms with the reality. We have to come to terms with what's actually happening. We have to look at things from a broadened lens. We have to take that forest versus trees perspective really in all aspects of life, but with education as well. We have to look at education and see potential, and we also have to observe the educational processes that our society is currently using within this broader template, within this broader lens. Are the underlying philosophies and foundations of education really something that is going to move us towards justice, or is it kind of another way of repeating and maintaining the status quo? And perhaps you're already sort of picking up on where I might be going with this video, but I want to talk about the ways that education perpetuates injustice. So this wasn't something that I really thought about until I took a course for when I was working towards a PhD in sociology. I've since decided that academia is not for me, which we'll discuss. But for a while I was pursuing a PhD in sociology, and I took a course on educational inequality that really sort of started to shift my paradigm, to change my mindset about what education was actually designed to do. So I want to talk about sort of the main themes I see of education from elementary school up to the college level, sort of the main underlying philosophies that I see us as a society, us as a modern United States society currently following in terms of what are we really prioritizing at these different levels. So when you think about, and I invite you too to think about your own experiences as I'm talking and see if this aligns with your experience. Does it resonate for you as well? If not, of course, that is your experience is your own experience, and for a lot of people, education has been a pathway out of a situation they didn't want to be in. So none of this is to take anything away from those experiences. It's also to just add a little perspective on a larger scale of what are we really intending to do here? What is when we talk about intent versus impact, what is our intention? What is our intent with education? And what is the actual impact that we're having with education? So if we think back to elementary school, what were some of the main lessons you feel you walked away with? When I think about elementary school processes, I remember some of the basics, right? I remember reciting the Pledge of Allegiance in the morning and learning how to memorize the words to the Pledge of Allegiance. U.S. history is something that's talked a lot about. We've talked a lot about that in this class. The ways that elementary school students are taught history is often very whitewashed, meaning coming from a lens of whiteness, not really taking into account what the experiences were like for people who were not white, who were living here on this land at that particular point in history. We're often given this very easy to digest version of American history, right? Like, the white settlers arrived, they made arrangements with the Native Americans who are here about how to divvy up the land, slavery happened, that was really bad, that shouldn't have happened, luckily that ended, and now we're beyond all the bad things that happened in our past. For a lot of you, that might be the version of history you were taught. That was definitely the version of history that I was taught in elementary school, was a very cut and dry, straightforward, maybe we made some mistakes, but it really has no impact now. We figured everything out. As we're learning through books like The New Jim Crow or An Indigenous People's History of the United States, that's not the case. The social problems that created this country are ongoing social problems into today. Slavery never ended. Genocide against indigenous populations never ended. They just transformed, and they look a little different now today than they did back then. So when I think about the purpose of elementary school, beyond those main topics, like what were the main subjects that people learned? Reading, writing, and arithmetic. Who set the standard for those? If we think about indigenous populations, what kind of education systems do we think that they would have built? Would they have been teaching their children reading, writing, and arithmetic? I mean, especially being here in a place like this with my partner and I for the last just over 2 months now, the natural processes of living are not something that is taught at an elementary school level. How to work with nature, how to care for nature, how to use the earth in a sustainable way in order to survive as a human species. None of those things are taught in elementary school. If I were to envision what an indigenous population would want to teach their children, that's one of the main things. That's one of the main things that Eurocentric values have kind of overtaken when it comes to indigenous belief systems as well. So our children, Eurocentric value-wise, learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. And they learn this very basic, straightforward version of history. And they learn the Pledge of Allegiance. If I'm thinking about a theme for what the elementary school experience is intended to instill within children, it's patriotism. It's a belief that this is the way things should be. Our way is the right way. Other people's way is not the right way. So that to me really comes up when I think about elementary school. Let's move on to high school. Thinking about your high school days, I'd invite you to just reflect for a moment. What are some of the main lessons, the main overall underlying belief systems, the main sort of perspectives that were ingrained within you? What were some of the main things that came up in your own high school experience? For me, I think a lot about peer pressure. I think a lot about gender roles in high school. That was one of the topics that I actually studied in that class that I mentioned on inequality in education systems. One of the books that I read for that was called Dude, You're a Fag, and it was written from a sociologist who basically embedded herself within a high school setting. I think it was in California or somewhere, but just a random high school setting, just an average high school. She embedded herself within that high school, observed the processes that were playing out, the relationship dynamics between the teenagers who were going to school there, between the adults who were working there, and between the teenagers and the adults who were both there. And one of the main things she focused on was how gender is dictated at that time. Let me move this a little bit. The sun's kind of coming in. So one of the main things that she focused on, it's still sunny, but that's fine. I'll just look like I'm glowing a little bit, was the gender dynamics. So the book is called Dude, You're a Fag because one of the things that she focused on was the dynamics that would play out between teenage boys who were essentially trying to prove that they were man enough, that they were masculine enough, that they were whatever enough. And it's true for people who are assigned female at birth as well. If they're in high school and presenting as female, they're expected to behave a certain way. So she wrote this book about those sorts of socialization processes, the way that adolescents use essentially different forms of peer pressure and expectation to conform in order to sort of create and confine what each of us are supposed to be. So I would imagine a lot of you, if not all of you, had similar experiences in high school where there were times when you were told that you were doing things the wrong way, that whoever you were being was not who you were supposed to be being, was not good enough, was not manly enough, was not feminine enough. Girls, you better cross your legs and sit politely and pay attention, and boys, don't cry, you better suck it up and tough it out. We all get these kinds of messages, and in my experience and the topics that I've studied, a lot of that happens at this high school level, So on top of the peer pressure and that socialization aspect of high school, there's a lot of emphasis on following the rules in high schools. I wonder how many of you had police officers who were embedded within your schools. I think they're maybe called school resource officers or something like that. So the disciplinary processes of high school is another major theme that stands out to me in terms of following the rules, getting your homework in on time. I actually got a day of in-school suspension when I was in high school because I was late to homeroom too many times. In my homeroom, all we did was sit around in silence, or our homeroom teacher person would read from this like book of jokes that he had. Now let me ask you, I had to miss a day full of classes because I was late to homeroom, where we either sat in silence or the teacher read jokes. Like, which is more important, right? Like, what are some of our disciplinary processes really doing here? It becomes a lot about power and control. You better listen to your teachers, you better not talk back, you better not question anything, you better just do what you're told. I remember also having debate, I would suppose, with an English teacher that I had at the time, who docked points on an assignment that I had turned in, telling me that I had a lot of run-on sentences. And I was a little bit of a nerd in high school, and I had gotten into grammar and spelling pretty well in comma usage in high school, and I believed she was wrong. And so anyways, there was this like power dynamic struggle that she was wrong. I knew she was wrong, but she's a teacher, and what do you do? So there's this very like strong emphasis on these power dynamics and following in line, and again, conformity is really something that stands out to me, and that's a process that as adolescents we do to ourselves, and then also that's a process that's being placed upon us that's being taught to us by the teachers, by the school resource officers or the police officers who are in schools. So elementary school, patriotism I see as a theme. High school, conformity I see as a theme. What do you think I'm going to say about college? So this one's a bit more challenging, and potentially challenging because, a lot of us are still in college. I have my bachelor's degree. I also have a dual master's degree. So I spent 8 years at college level education, plus an additional 3 years in a PhD program for sociology, as I mentioned. And then I've adjuncted before this, but I was also a full-time faculty member for 4 years teaching. So I've seen sort of both sides of academia. And what really stands out to me when I think about the main purposes and processes of college level education, so bachelor's and higher, is this emphasis on professionalization, which like at first hint may not, sound like it's super relevant to institutional oppression, but stay with me. So professionalism, but mostly civilization. Okay, so what do I mean by civilization? So what I mean by civilization is the processes that teach us what it means to be a civil person. And I'm using this term intentionally. So if we can rewind the clock a little bit, let's rewind the clock of history a little bit, and we think back to when European invaders, essentially, arrived on this land and encountered indigenous populations who had been here long before. There became this massive emphasis on the process of civilization. Maybe you've even heard the saying, kill the Indian, save the man. So that's in reference to that time period when they used things like boarding schools to quite literally strip indigenous populations of their culture, kill the culture, and save the man, meaning instill within those people, instill within those indigenous people, the value systems of white Europeans. The value systems of white Europeans being the language they used, the religions they practiced, the education that was provided, what was deemed as appropriate and not appropriate. There's a book called The Body and Society. There's a book called The Body and Society. If you're in my institutional oppression class, you'll actually be reading a few excerpts from this book in a couple weeks when we talk about I believe when we talk about trauma and how that shows up in our brains and bodies. But essentially this book talks about the same sort of concept of how the human body has been forced to rather be civilized over time. the ways that we view people's dress and attire. So, I mean, you can see my hair, for example. When I was a student, I played into the gender roles. I played into the professional roles. I did not have visible tattoos. I had long feminine hair. I wore makeup. I presented my external self in a way that was in line with professional values. Who sets those professional values? Why is it that we are socialized to believe that a person with longer hair and let's say I'm wearing a professional dress, why are we socialized to believe that that person knows more than someone who looks like me who's now sitting in front of you right now, wearing crystal jewelry and having tattoos and not wearing makeup and having part of a, non-traditional hairstyle? That's the process of civilization. The process of civilization teaches us that there are certain ways to be human, and those ways are good. And to be those, you have more value, you deserve more respect, you are somehow better than, as opposed to uncivilized people, right? Who don't talk the right way, maybe they don't know how to read, they don't dress the right way, they don't know social cues in the same way. All of these are processes that have become associated with professionalism, which has become associated with knowledge. And so this is where we run into those tricky issues. If the purpose of our college level education processes are to teach us how to speak a certain way, to write a certain way, to look a certain way, to act a certain way, to believe a certain way, we're being taught how to be someone, right? And who that person is rooted in colonization, is rooted in the process of colonization that is ultimately the philosophy that says certain people are worthy, certain people are unworthy. So a lot of this is talked about in the book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. She presents some of this from a certain lens. And it can be a lot to think about, especially if you are in the social work profession, because a lot of our professional values speak to some of these things. The educational standards that are placed upon you are reflective of these underlying foundational aspects of colonization. And none of this is to say that writing isn't important and that communication isn't important. That's not the point that I'm trying to make here. The point is when we have a culture that decides that this way is good and this way is bad, we run into issues of hierarchy and social injustice. So speaking about my time as an instructor, when I was a full-time faculty member and teaching full-time, was when I really started to realize how often I was embodying the values of the oppressor that I didn't want to embody after all. Because, okay, let's take this a level deeper. If we're thinking of, so early on in my teaching role, if you knew me then, or if you knew anybody who had me then, I had a reputation of being a pretty tough grader. And specifically, I was really focused on grammar, I was really focused on writing, I was really focused on APA style citations, I was really focused on what I now would perceive as these aspects of civilization, these aspects of teaching people how to be professionals in a way that's reflecting Eurocentric values as professional. I started to notice that there were certain students who would excel, no problem, A's on all their papers, but didn't really seem to be trying that hard, right? Didn't really seem to be fully engaging with the material, but they knew how to meet the requirements. So they aced all their classes, 4.0 grade average. I mean, I'm gonna keep it real with you. That student was me when I was in college. I didn't read all the readings. I didn't apply my full potential. A lot of the times I didn't feel like there was enough value in what I was learning for me to be, drawn in and want to learn it on a deeper level. But I skated by as much as I could. And, I had that high GPA. So I'm speaking about this from a personal lens as well. So on the other hand, there are students who systems have failed, right? If we think about it from that sort of lens, there are students who have not gotten good instruction on Oh my God, math. Whew, statistics is one of the courses that I teach, and math is a major issue. The teaching of math varies so drastically from one school experience to the next, and that's heavily dependent on how much money that school district has, which hopefully, as we're seeing, we're understanding, we're realizing, is heavily dependent on aspects of oppression, on race, on gender, on generational poverty, on all of that. So math is a huge issue, but even spelling and grammar. Who are the students? Why would students come into college fully knowing how to write, how to spell, how to have proper grammar, how to cite in the appropriate way? The students who know how to do those things are students who have gone to schools that have prepared them to do those things, right? And the students who have gone to schools to prepare them to do those things, much more likely to be white, much more likely to be upper middle class, much more likely to have a lot more resources than the students who are going to struggle. And I saw that teaching. I saw students who were trying their hardest and getting C's, and I saw students like me when I was younger who were skating through and getting A's. And what kind of a system is set up that way, right? Like, what kind of a system is set up that way? On top of that, let's talk about the trauma of education. So especially if you're watching this and you're a social work student, you have had to do, or you will have to do, a practicum, which is basically unpaid labor unless you're one of the ones who finds a loophole and a way to get it paid, financed. So we are not the only program that has an internship. We are not the only program that has those requirements. Even programs that don't have an internship style type of requirement, incredibly difficult. I still remember, I mean, it took me like 2-3 years after graduating with my master's degree to start to feel like I finally could use my free time and not feel guilty and not be like, oh gosh, what am I forgetting to do right now? Because that's what education systems do to us. They train us to be in these like constant flight states of like to-do lists swirling in our head, and I better not let this class down, and if this teacher doesn't get my paper, then I'm in big trouble, whatever. The traumatic aspect of education affects, I really think, all of us. School is a very stressful thing to do as it is designed currently, but especially those who are already at risk, those who are already struggling with their own trauma histories, those who are struggling with issues of being in poverty, those who are single parents, especially in this particular point in history, those who find themselves at the intersections of, different culture wars, essentially, people of color, Black people especially. The amount of stress in the environment right now is horrific for everybody, and especially when you have this shared identity of different populations who are being targeted. When we look at graduation rates and see that people of color, indigenous populations, Black populations, Latinx populations, when we see that there are patterns in graduation rates, we have to think, we have to know, we have to start recognizing that means that there's something deeper at play. It's exclusionary. And again, the people who are dictating the terms, the people who are determining here's how grading processes are going to work, here's what's valuable in terms of education, spelling, grammar, APA, whatever, and here's what's not, sometimes critical thinking. There is no accident to the decisions that are made about what education is and what education should be. So it replicates, education is a major way that we see these kinds of injustices replicating. This is ultimately what drove me out of academia, was realizing that I was embodying values that I didn't want to embody, and also sort of realizing that it's a little bit of a trap to a certain extent. It's really hard to break out of those processes when they're so deeply embedded. I had one too many conversations with students who were suicidal. I had one too many conversations with especially students of color, but also students who were gender nonconforming, or students who had been marginalized for another aspect of their identity. I've seen one too many of these students really hit hard by these educational processes that at a certain point I had to walk out to walk on. So I record this video, I hope not to leave you feeling hopeless about the state of education, but just to in part validate some of your own experiences, You know, another thing education, especially college, does is it teaches us to internalize the blame. One thing I realized through initiating open classroom conversations, actually in my in-person classes, how I'll start pretty much every class is just an open sharing of like, how is everybody? I call them check-ins, and everybody goes around and people can share something or not share something or whatever. And one of the patterns that I saw after, you know, doing that over the 4 years I've been teaching is there's so much belief that we're alone in the struggles that we're facing. There's so many people who believe that they are the problem, which again, if we want to unpack that to the root, you know, American individualism teaches us that if you're failing, it's your own damn fault. You did this, you better figure it out. When we look at things from a bigger picture lens, a macro lens, we have to realize that's not the reality. If there's patterns, there's something going on. If there's a lot of people who feel the same way, there's something going on. And that's what I realized. I saw so many students who would express how stressed they were, how overwhelmed they were, how insecure they felt, questioning whether they even belonged there, whether education was something they could do or maybe they weren't good enough for. And when we opened those conversations in an environment where they felt safe, they were able to see that they weren't alone in that. And I feel like that's really important. So again, to bring this back to the point, one of the reasons I wanted to sort of so candidly share some of this is that I want all of us to know, especially if you're someone who has felt insecure or stupid or like you couldn't do something or like you were less than, I want you to know that that's not true and that systems are what teach us that about ourselves. And systems are not reality. Systems are socially constructed, which we'll talk about in more depth another week as well. So that's one of my main emphases here, is that I hope that something that I've shared has resonated in some way in that way. Additionally, the reality is that we can't change what we don't know, right? Can't change what we don't know. We can't travel where we won't go. We have to be willing to look at problems, and we have to be willing to understand them, and we have to be willing to see them. Only when those pieces come into play can we actually change anything that's going on. So much of what I've seen in various contexts of even nonprofits and education systems is this emphasis on let's just keep doing what we're doing. Let's just keep doing what we're doing. Let's not question it too much. Let's not think about it too hard. Let's just keep doing what we're doing and let's try to do it better. Let's try to do it stronger. Let's try to get more money when we do it. And what that does is, again, it causes us to lose sight of the forest. And it prevents us from making changes that need to happen. Where if we were able to take a critically reflective lens to, you know, some of the things that I've talked about today, then we would be able to make some sort of change in the long term. I would love it if folks wanted to share comments below about anything that resonated or didn't resonate or anything really that you'd want to share. And yes, no, you are not alone. We have a lot of work to do in the society. Yes, there are budding ways some of these conversations are starting to happen. You know, education can be an incredibly powerful tool, and I see that is where education is headed in some ways. It's just we have to get to the bottom of some of what's not working in order for us to actually change it. All right, until next time, I wish you all a lovely day.